Perdianu, lovingly known as Dian by everyone close to him, was a young man of 27 whose life began far from the glittering cities of the world. His childhood unfolded in a small West Java village surrounded by rice paddies, muddy fields, and the scent of wet soil after rain. His family worked hard yet earned little. His father took odd jobs, while his mother sometimes sold vegetables at the market. Poverty was familiar, but so was warmth, the kind that lives inside families who possess little but love each other immensely. From a young age, Diane learned to survive without complaint. He woke before dawn to help his father, carried sacks of grain heavier than his slim arms, and returned home each evening with aching muscles but an honest smile. There were days when meals were simple, sometimes only rice and salt, but he always believed one day life would open a wider road for him. Hope is the kind of wealth poor men carry like gold. When his younger brother, Eddie, entered school, expenses grew beyond what the family could manage. That was when Diane made the biggest decision of his life, a decision shaped by love rather than ambition. He would leave his land, his mountains, his mother's cooking, and everything familiar. He would become a migrant worker in Saudi Arabia. He was only 25 then, too young, some said, but bravery does not always wait for age. His arrival in Saudi Arabia was nothing like he had imagined. The weather was hotter, the language unfamiliar, and the streets larger than anything he had ever seen. Yet Diane, with his unpolished but determined heart, endured. He worked at a property material shop owned by a wealthy family, people whose lives stood far above his own in luxury and comfort. Marble floors, expensive furniture, imported cars, objects Diane had seen only in movies were now part of his daily surroundings. His job began small, managing stock, sweeping floors, delivering documents, assisting other workers during peak hours. But working hard was a habit he never needed to learn. It was stitched into him from childhood. Soon, everyone noticed the quiet Indonesian boy who never refused tasks, who smiled even when tired and worked as though he were protecting something sacred. Within months, trust began to form. 5 months later, everything changed. Diane was promoted to personal family driver. He moved into the family mansion, a grand house with towering pillars, carved doors, alabaster lamps, and a garden that smelled of jasmine at night. His room was modest compared to the rest of the building, yet for Diane, it felt royal. He now drove the employer's elderly mother for shopping trips and appointments, picked up the employer's husband from his office, answered calls, and stood ready by the gate each morning with polished shoes and a respectful bow. For the first time in his life, he earned enough to not only survive, but to give. He sent money home, repaired his parents' collapsing house, even bought a small piece of paddy field, fulfilling a dream his father believed he would never see in this lifetime. Each video call to his family brought new joy, cracks in the wall disappearing, smiles growing wider, Eddie studying with new books. Across oceans, his sweat turned into happiness. Diane never knew fate was preparing something even larger, something that would change not only his future, but his place in the very house he served. Diane could never have predicted how deeply his presence would become woven into the fabric of the household he served. What began as simple employment gradually turned into something far more meaningful, a bond of trust that neither wealth nor status could manufacture. The family he worked for, Mr. Marwan and Mrs. Najla, had everything people called success. Businesses that stretched across the city, luxury villas, property investments, and a home that resembled a palace more than a residence. Yet there was one thing neither money nor medicine had given them over decades of marriage: a child. Diane never intruded into their personal affairs, but whispers among staff often reached him about fertility treatments, trips abroad, prayers, hope followed by disappointment, year after year. He never imagined he would one day witness the moment hope returned to that household in the most unexpected way. One quiet morning, just as sunlight filtered softly through the large living room windows, Diane was asked to accompany Madame Najla to the hospital. Her movements had been slower lately, fatigue noticeable in her steps. She was nearing 60, and though she rarely spoke of discomfort, small sighs escaped her when she walked. Diane waited patiently in the hospital lobby while she went inside for examination. He sat upright, hands folded, eyes occasionally drifting toward the large glass doors as if hoping time would move faster. His heart was uneasy, a strange mixture of concern, respect, and worry for the woman who had trusted him so much. Minutes turned into an hour. Then he saw her, stepping out of the doctor's room, trembling, clutching the report in both hands. Tears glazed her eyes, but her lips slowly broke into a smile that held a world of disbelief. Alhamdulillah, she whispered, barely loud enough to hear. She approached Diane, voice shaking with emotion. Diane, I am pregnant. For a moment, Diane could only stare. Stunned, speechless. Then joy spread across his face like sunrise. Masya Allah, madame. Congratulations. This is beautiful news. A miracle no one expected. A child at nearly 60. A new heartbeat inside a woman who had long accepted motherhood might never come. That single moment shifted the atmosphere of the entire mansion. Mr. Marwan was overjoyed but overwhelmed with work commitments, often traveling, unable to accompany his wife everywhere. So naturally, responsibility fell to the one person they trusted most, Diane. He became more than a driver. He became her support, her careful guide through every hospital visit, every step she took. He checked seatbelts, monitored car temperature, carried medical files, steadied her hand when she walked. He made sure nothing, not even a slippery floor, would risk the precious life inside her. Days passed. Weeks became months. As the pregnancy reached its 6th month, routines changed. The house slowed down like a mother preparing for a newborn. Diane adjusted his life completely around Najla's well-being, not because he was ordered to, but because gratitude made loyalty natural. During quiet hours, he washed the family cars by, not rushed or mechanical, but softly, almost with affection. He wiped the windows until they gleamed, arranged potted flowers neatly, swept the back garden so mornings smelled fresh. He didn't notice Najla sometimes stood by the balcony, watching him in silence, her hand resting on her growing belly. There were workers in the world who did what they must, but Diane worked as though the home belonged to his heart. She began saying it more often. Diane, without you, I could not manage. He smiled every time, shy but proud. The miracle child had brought happiness, and Diane had become the anchor holding it steady. But destiny, as always, never lets joy settle too long without testing it. One afternoon full of golden sunlight, when the world seemed gentle, the phone rang and shattered everything. Mr. Marwan had suffered a sudden heart attack. By the time Najla reached the hospital, the man she loved for years was gone. A pregnant widow at 60, trembling with grief. And in that storm of heartbreak, grief entered the mansion like an unwelcome shadow, stretching through the corridors that had once echoed with calm routine. The news of Mr. Marwan's death arrived like a storm, sudden, merciless, without time to prepare a heart that was already fragile with pregnancy. Najla collapsed upon hearing it, pale and trembling, and Diane had been the one to hold her upright as her world fell apart. He drove her to the hospital with urgency running like fire through his veins. The steering wheel felt heavy, almost alive with the weight of responsibility. He glanced repeatedly in the mirror to ensure she hadn't fainted. Her tears fell silently, her fingers clutching the small bag belonging to her late husband, as though holding the memory of him was the only thing keeping her breathing. In the hospital corridor, when the doctor confirmed what she already feared, Najla broke. She pressed her face against her husband's still chest, shaking with sobs that came from years of love, and the sudden horror of facing motherhood alone. Diane stood back respectfully, eyes lowered, heart tight with sympathy he couldn't put into words. He wasn't family, not by name, not by blood, but at that moment he felt connected to their sorrow as if it were his own. The funeral was held quickly, as tradition required. Relatives filled the mansion for 3 days. Reciting prayers, remembering Marwan's generosity, comforting Najla with soft words that melted as soon as they were spoken. But grief lingers longer than guests, and when they finally departed, the house became unbearably quiet. Only 3 souls remained. Najla, widowed, 7 months pregnant, emotionally brittle. Diane, once an employee, now the only source of strength in the home. Siti, the housemaid from Indonesia, gentle and observant. Nights became the most difficult. Najla often sat in the living room long after midnight, one hand on her belly, eyes fixed on framed photographs of her late husband. The silence pressed on her like a weight. One night, she whispered through trembling lips, "He should have lived long enough to see this child." Diane, sitting nearby, lowered his gaze respectfully. "Madame, he must be proud of you. You carry his miracle. You are not alone. I am here. Always." Those words were simple, but they became a lifeline. Najla looked up slowly, her eyes softening through tears. In loneliness, even small kindness feels like rescue. As weeks passed, Dan became more than a driver. He became her listener, her companion through grief. In the mornings, he prepared breakfast carefully. Warm milk, soft bread, fruit cut gently so she wouldn't feel overwhelmed by heavy meals. He watched her appetite, encouraged her to eat, and reminded her that her health was now 2 lives, not 1. In the afternoons, when sadness made her retreat into silence, Dean suggested quiet walks or short outings, only when she felt strong enough. At the mall, he walked beside her like a subtle guardian angel, not too close, but close enough to catch her if emotion weakened her legs. Najla noticed everything: how he opened doors with respect, how he slowed his steps to match her pace, how he smiled lightly whenever she managed to laugh. She began to feel something she couldn't name. Was it gratitude? Was it reliance? Or was it the stirring of affection born from loneliness and the steady presence of a man who never left her side? Sometimes she would lie awake wondering, if I asked him, would he stay in my life? Not just as a driver, but as someone more? She pushed those thoughts away each time, ashamed of herself, frightened of her own heart, yet unable to silence it completely. Because when the world left her empty, Deanne had become the only warmth left, and feelings planted in grief often grow faster than one expects. A tender seed had formed, quiet, hesitant, but alive. Soon it would demand to be spoken. Days stretched into weeks, and grief slowly softened into a quiet ache rather than an open wound. The mansion remained large, but it no longer felt hollow, not when Dean's footsteps could be heard in the hallways, not when his voice gently filled the silence that once suffocated Najla. Even Siti noticed that her employer began smiling more often, though the sadness never fully vanished from her eyes. Najla now entered her 8th month of pregnancy. Her stomach had grown visibly round, and her movements became slower, careful, sometimes accompanied by soft breaths of discomfort. Yet there was a glow to her, a strange, gentle radiance that loneliness could not extinguish. Often the glow appeared when she watched Deanne from afar. When he polished the cars with quiet dedication, when he tended the backyard plants she once neglected, when he walked through the home with the ease of someone who belonged. The seed of affection she had tried to bury began to root deeper. Every night she told herself she must not allow such feelings. The age gap between them was wide. She was a grieving widow, pregnant with another man's child. Deanne was young, kind, full of life ahead of him. He deserved someone equal, someone who could stand beside him without the weight of years and sorrow. Yet the heart rarely obeys reason. One afternoon, Najla watched him through the window. Deanne was in the garage, sleeves rolled to his elbows, water shimmering on the car's surface as he washed it under the soft afternoon sun. Something about the moment struck Najla deeply. Perhaps it was his sincerity, or the calm strength in his movements, or perhaps because every time she looked at him, she felt less alone. She stood at the doorway silently, gathering courage she couldn't understand. Finally, she called to him softly to, "Diane, can you come here for a moment?" He turned, surprised, wiping his hands with a cloth before approaching. When he stood before her, she noticed how his expression immediately shifted into concern. "Madam, are you feeling unwell? Your face looks anxious. Should I call the doctor?" Najla shook her head gently, though her heartbeat thudded against her ribs like a frightened bird. "No, Dian. I'm fine. I just want to talk to you." She sat down slowly on a chair near the garage. He remained standing, respectfully bowing his head, unsure what she needed. For a few moments she said nothing, simply breathing, steadying herself. Her hands trembled slightly on her stomach. Then she spoke. "Diane, you have done more good than I ever expected from anyone. You held this house when it nearly collapsed. You held me when I could barely walk through my loss. Her voice wavered. And there is something I have carried inside me. Quietly. But I cannot hide it anymore. Deanne's mind raced. Had he made a mistake? Had he unknowingly offended her? He swallowed hard. What do you mean, madame? Her eyes lifted to meet his. Not with the gaze of an employer, but of a woman shedding fear. Deanne, she whispered, I want you to be my husband. Time froze. The world around them, the quiet garage, the sparkling car, the warm sunlight, all blurred into nothing. Deanne stared in disbelief, lips parted in shock, heart pounding with confusion so loud he could almost hear it. Najla continued through trembling breath. I know this is unexpected. I know I am older. I know I am carrying my late husband's child. But my heart has chosen, and I can't deny it. Tears glimmered in her eyes. I don't ask you out of obligation. I don't command you as an employer. I ask you as a woman who has learned to love again. She paused. Then, with courage almost painful to witness, she added, If you agree, I will give everything, my home, my wealth, my care for your family, because what I seek is not a servant, but a companion, a partner, you. Dean's breath shook. This was more than a proposal. It was a door to a life he never imagined, a life wrapped in gratitude, responsibility, and love. He felt his world turning toward a choice that would rewrite destiny. The air between them felt heavy, not with discomfort, but with the weight of a future neither had expected to face. Deanne stood silent for several moments, his heart racing, his mind a crowded storm. He was only 27, a simple village boy, a son who once left home seeking enough money to buy rice and school books. And now he was being asked to step into a life so enormous it frightened him. Najla's eyes remained fixed on him, filled with vulnerability rather than authority. She had confessed everything, her loneliness, her hope, her need for a partner in a world that had suddenly turned cold. Her voice earlier had trembled like someone placing their entire heart into another's hands. Diane finally exhaled, long and slow. His voice, when it emerged, was barely more than a whisper. Madam, are you truly sure? The question wasn't refusal. It was fear. A human fear of not being enough. Najla nodded softly, her tears finally falling in quiet streams. I have thought about this for many nights. I have fought my feelings. I told myself it was wrong, too strange, too unexpected. But no matter how I tried to kill it, it grew. Because you stayed when everyone left. Because you care without being asked. Because when I look at you, I feel safe. Her voice cracked, raw, honest, undeniably real. I don't want you to accept out of pity. I don't want you to say yes because you think you owe me something. I want you to marry me only if your heart can walk beside mine. Even with our differences, even with the child I carry. There was silence, deep enough to hear birds outside the garage and the soft drip of water from the car's bumper. Diane raised his eyes slowly, and something inside him settled. He remembered his parents' cracked walls finally repaired. He remembered buying a piece of rice field his father never thought he'd own. He remembered nights when hunger lived in his stomach like a stone, and how fate had carried him to a home of gold. But more than prosperity, he thought of Najla, soft-voiced, resilient, gentle. How she trusted him more than anyone. How she always smiled warmly whenever he entered the room. How her eyes sought him when fear or sadness struck. Maybe love didn't always come like lightning. Maybe sometimes it grew slowly, like dawn creeping across rice fields. With a steady breath, Dean looked into her eyes. If you are certain, he whispered, voice now calm, then I am willing. Najla froze, as if she feared she had misheard. Then her hand covered her mouth as sobs escaped her, not sorrowful ones, but relieved, overflowing with joy she thought she had lost forever. Thank you, Deanne. Thank you, she cried softly. They didn't embrace. Not yet. Respect and awe kept them a gentle distance apart, but their hearts had already drawn closer than any touch could measure. That night, Diane called home. His parents reacted exactly as he expected. Shock thick at first, disbelief heavy. His mother worried. His father warned him not to be blinded by wealth or kindness alone. But when Diane assured them this was not a forced path, that it was chosen by both hearts, silence softened into acceptance. "If you believe this is your future," his father finally said, "then we will not stand in the way. Our blessing is with you, as long as you protect her and she protects you." Tears rolled down Diane's face as the call ended. For the first time in his life, he felt like a man standing at the threshold of destiny. A simple ceremony followed days later, quiet, respectful, with only a small circle of witnesses. Najla wore soft pastel fabric, glowing with pregnancy and emotion. Diane wore a clean suit, nervous but determined. When vows were spoken, his voice was steady, hers trembling through tears. And when the officiant declared them husband and wife, something inside Diane shifted forever. He was no longer a migrant worker. He was a husband, a future father, a partner in a life far beyond anything he once imagined. The wedding changed Diane's world overnight, not by thunder or spectacle, but through a quiet transformation that reshaped every corner of his life. The home he once entered with bowed posture was now the place where he belonged. Najla was no longer Madame, but his wife, someone whose hand he was permitted to hold, someone whose smile he could now answer with warmth instead of formality. Yet even as joy settled into the house, there remained a gentle awkwardness between them. A newness neither of them quite knew how to navigate. Their marriage was tender, respectful, slow like dawn unfolding across a sleeping city. Najla was 8 months pregnant now, her movements heavier, breath shorter. Diane became more than a husband. He became her support, her second strength. He helped her stand, held her arm on staircases, massaged her back when pregnancy aches tightened her muscles. Sometimes she dozed with her head resting on his shoulder, and he sat still for hours, afraid to move, afraid to disturb the peace she hadn't felt in months. But there were moments that made him smile. Small, precious, mundane things. One evening, Najla appeared wearing a simple dress and invited him outside. "Come, Diane, help me visit the garden. It has been too long." It startled him. She was heavily pregnant, the ground uneven. But she insisted, joking that the flowers must have forgotten the sound of footsteps. With slow steps and his steady hand at her elbow, they went. The yard, once neglected during her grief, was overgrown, weeds rising like stubborn soldiers across the earth. Diane immediately took tools and began trimming, sweeping, clearing, while Najla watched from the patio chair. When he finished, she tapped her walking stick lightly on the tiles. "You see," she teased softly, "with a little effort, even wild land becomes beautiful again." Diane understood the hidden meaning, but grief could be tended too. Pain, like weeds, could be cut back slowly until hope returned. Their days fell into a rhythm, gentle, quiet, almost healing. Morning tea in the living room, slow walks in the garden, nights spent talking softly until sleep took them both. But beneath the tenderness was another truth. A child was coming, a new life, a new identity for Diane, who had once only dreamed of sending money home. Now he would hold a baby raised under his protection. The moment arrived without warning. One morning, Najla's breath came sharp and fast. Her hand clutched her belly, eyes wide with panic. Diane froze only for a second, then instinct took control. He supported her carefully to the car, voice calm despite the storm inside him, urging her to breathe, wiping sweat from her forehead, whispering prayers between his teeth. At the hospital, he paced endlessly, unable to sit still, his palms damp, his heart punching against his ribs like a desperate drum. Hours stretched like years. Then, a cry. High, soft, the buzz, alive. A nurse emerged with a smile. "Congratulations, sir. You have a baby girl. Healthy and beautiful." His knees nearly weakened. Tears blurred his vision as he stepped forward to see the tiny life wrapped in soft cloth. Her fingers were small as flower petals, her face peaceful like fresh dawn. When he touched her, something inside him broke open. Not pain, but a love so large it frightened him. When Najla was wheeled out, exhausted but glowing, Deanne stood beside her, baby in his arms. She looked up, eyes full of tears. "Deanne, we are a family." He nodded slowly, overwhelmed, grateful, changed forever. For days after returning home, Deanne hardly slept. Not from stress, but from tenderness. Every whimper woke him. Every small cry pulled him to action, preparing milk, changing cloth, walking back and forth through quiet hallways, with soft humming only fathers learn after holding a child long enough. Najla would watch from the bed, heart full, because love is not only in vows but in gentle hands at dawn. Their house, once filled with grief and silence, now echoed with tiny breaths and new beginnings. A daughter had brought laughter where there was loss, warmth where coldness once rested like stone. And Deanne, who once polished cars and swept floors, now carried a baby in his arms and a future across his shoulders. He was no longer just surviving, he was building a life. When Deanne returned home from the airport, his chest carried a mixture of joy and longing. His parents were gone back to their land, yet they left behind something precious, a sense of fulfillment. They had seen his new life. They had held their grandchild. They had gone to Umrah with ease and dignity, something that once felt impossible for a family that used to count coins before buying rice. Najla stood at the doorway when Deanne arrived, their daughter in her arms. She didn't speak, she only smiled, as though she understood everything that lived inside his heart. Days passed like soft pages of a diary. Deanne slipped deeper into his new identity, not a servant anymore, but a husband and father. He still woke early, still helped around the house, still washed the cars out of habit, but there was no employer watching him. This time he did it because he loved this home. Because his footsteps were as natural here as the ticking of the clock in the hallway. Najla recovered with surprising strength. Motherhood transformed her. The widow who once cried alone in quiet rooms was now a gentle flame that warmed the house. Some mornings she sat with Deanne in the living room, baby cradled in her arms, her voice soft as silk. "Do you ever think," she asked one dawn-colored morning, "that life has a strange way of giving what we never dared to dream of?" Diane smiled. "Every day." Their love was not youthful and fiery. It grew instead like a slow-burning lantern, warm, steady, impossible to extinguish. There were nights when Najla leaned against him while the baby slept between them, and Deanne would run a hand across her hair gently, thinking of how destiny had carried him to a place even imagination could not reach. As weeks went on, Najla insisted on simple routines together. Afternoon tea on the terrace, slow walks through the garden, bathing the baby side by side, laughing when tiny fingers splashed water on their clothes. Happiness no longer felt borrowed, it felt earned. Yet something else began to grow. A dream. Small at first, like a seed. One evening, Diane stood in the backyard with his baby in his arms. He looked at the moon, bright like silver stitched into the night, and whispered, "One day, I will take you to my village. You will run in fields I once worked with bare feet." Najla overheard him from the patio. She stepped closer, silent as wind, and slipped her hand into his free one. "And I will go with you," she said softly. "I want to see the land that shaped you." Diane looked at her, truly looked. A woman of status. He worried about whispers, envy, judgment. Najla sensed his fear. "People will talk," she said one night, head resting on his chest, "but let them. A life lived with sincerity needs no defense." He kissed the top of her head, soft, grateful. "We will go together," he said, "not as employer and worker, as husband and wife." And just like that, plans began. Documents prepared, bags packed, arrangements made. The next chapter of their lives was no longer inside a mansion of marble, but waiting across the ocean, where a boy once dreamed barefoot under the sun. And now he would return. Not as a servant, but as a man who had built a family with his own heart. The plane descended slowly over Indonesia, and Deanne's heart felt as if it were beating outside his chest. He pressed his forehead against the window, watching the green fields of his homeland spread like a memory come alive. Wide, warm, familiar. The same fields he once worked barefoot, the same land he left in search of a better future. Yet now he was not returning as a laborer. He was coming home as a husband, a father, and a provider with a life transformed beyond childhood dreams. Najla sat beside him, one hand on Amira's small sleeping body, the other resting gently on his arm. She looked at the landscape with curiosity, awe, and a softness she couldn't hide. This was the land that shaped the man who later shaped her life. She felt grateful, not for riches or comfort, but for the destiny that had brought her to him. When they arrived in the village, it was as though time paused. Neighbors emerged from homes, eyes wide, voices whispering behind hands. They remembered Diane as the boy who worked odd jobs, who left quietly to earn money abroad. But the young man who returned was different, confident, kind-eyed, arriving with a wife and child, radiating calm strength rather than pride. No expensive car or jewelry was needed. Dignity itself was his arrival. Diane's parents rushed forward first. His mother took Amira in trembling arms, tears falling like rain, while his father held his son for a long, wordless moment, a reunion stitched not with words but with heartbeats. The villagers gathered, first curious, then respectful. They welcomed Najla politely, some surprised by her age, others whispering about fate and fortune. But when they saw how she treated Diane's parents, not as servants to wealth but as her own family, the whispers softened into admiration. The days that followed were simple yet full. Najla learned to love the village, its quiet mornings, the smell of wood smoke, women chatting while hanging laundry, children running barefoot with laughter trailing behind them. She would sit beneath a mango tree with Diane's mother, sewing clothes for her granddaughter, listening to stories of Diane's childhood, how he chased chickens, fell in muddy rice paddies, and dreamed of a life larger than the horizon. Diane, meanwhile, walked across the same soil he once left behind, but with new footsteps. He visited his father's farmland, helped plant rice shoots, carried buckets from the well, and told stories of Saudi nights and prayers beside the Kaaba. Villagers stood around him, listening with pride rather than envy. He was no longer the boy who went away. He had come back a man who remembered every route, every memory, every sacrifice that brought him here. Amira grew quickly, crawling on woven mats, laughing under the sun, her tiny hands grabbing fistfuls of earth like she was claiming her heritage. While Najla rocked her at dusk, Diane would sit beside them and think, "This is life, quiet, real, blessed." Weeks passed, then months, and as time folded like pages in a book, Diane understood something deeply. Wealth was not in the marble floors or luxury cars left behind. Wealth was in mornings where 3 generations sat on the terrace sharing tea. Wealth was in his daughter's laughter echoing in the same yard he once played in as a child. Wealth was in a wife who loved him, not for what he provided, but for who he became. One evening, as sunset poured gold across the village sky, Diane held Najla close while Amira slept in her arms. Fireflies flickered like tiny stars around them. He whispered, "Who would have thought our lives would meet like this?" Najla smiled, older, wiser, radiant. "Sometimes," she answered, "God writes stories we never dare to imagine." He kissed her forehead gently, knowing every word was true. A boy left home with nothing but hope. He returned with more than he ever prayed for, a family, a future, a legacy. And in that simple village, beneath the soft breath of night, Diane understood he had not just found happiness, he had become it,